This is Garis, Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 314, entitled The Masculist Anti-Nagging-Pro-Nicing Campaign Against Women. This flyer, or description. This flyer introduces a masculist campaign directed against women to force them to nag men less and to become nicer to men, the way they were before monoconscious feminism turned women into misandrist, male-dumping feminazis. Now that men can be armed with masculist ideas, masculist rhetoric, thanks to the existence of masculist textbooks, men can harangue back at the misandrist statements made by women, causing women to fear being harangued by an angry masculist a second time. So these women learn to be nicer to men. Masculists also need to teach women masculism so that women become biconscious, learning that women oppress men too. So these women lose their anger bias against men, become biconscious, that is, aware that gender oppression is a two-way street, and hence become much nicer to men. Flyer itself. The Masculist Anti-Nagging-Pro-Nicing Campaign Against Women by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. A couple of weeks before writing this flyer, I was talking with a South African white male in Melbourne's famous Botanic Gardens, my favourite spot in the city. He had migrated to Australia a few years back. I asked him if there was a men's lib movement amongst the whites in SA. He said no. So I asked him, was there much of a women's lib movement in SA? He said yes, but that SA white women were much less feminist in their mentality than Australian women. He said that he thought Australian women, quote, had lost their femininity. I asked him to explain. He said that in comparison, Australian women were far less nice to Australian men than SA white women were to SA white men. I thought this was similar to what I experienced in China for the past 12 years when I was living there. Chinese women were much nicer to Chinese men than Oz women are to Oz men. Why is this? The obvious reason is feminism and the social technical developments that have led to feminism, particularly the contraceptive pill that men invented for women, household gadgets, so that women's traditional role of being a household drudge, doing time-consuming tasks like washing the clothes and cooking meals for large families, largely disappeared, so that women, even if they had 2 kids, had a career window of about half a century. So women streamed into the workforce and became FIPs, F-I-P, that's financially independent persons, in many cases. Traditional men often did not like the presence of women in the workforce, forcing men to change their behaviour towards female co-workers, rather than treating these new career women the way these men would treat other men, that is, other male co-workers. These new career women got angry at this and formed the second wave of feminism to fight for equal pay for equal work, equal opportunities to enter the professions, the right to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, etc. As a masculist, I have no problem with equal rights for women. In fact, as a masculist, equal rights for women is a masculist prerequisite for women to be able to become FIPs, which is a vital concept to the masculists, who are pushing for the creation of a FIP society, in which all women are FIPs and all girls are socialized by parents and taught by teachers to be FIPs, so that when they grow up, they do not become fluffies, that is, traditional women who expect to be able to parasite off the money of a man. The Masculists have a hatred of fluffies, seeing them as manslavers, that is, immoral, parasitic, man-slaving vermin to be killed off slowly by being totally ignored by men, not even being pumped and dumped. These second-wave feminist women evolved into third-wave feminists a generation later, pushing for the empowerment of women, often at men's expense, and often with real hypocrisy, especially in the divorce courts, which financially massacre and destroy the lives of one father in 4 in Western countries. For the past half-century, women, that is the feminists, have had a monopoly on gender politics, causing women to become what the Masculists call monoconscious. That is, they have only had their feminist consciousness raised. They only know of one instance of gender oppression, that is, of women by men. They are not biconscious, that is, they do not see that gender oppression of one gender by the other is a two-way street. These monoconscious feminists understandably became angry at men because they had studied how men oppress women, but did not study how women oppress men, for the simple reason there was no masculism around to teach them that women oppress men too, that is, until recently. As a result of this monoconsciousness on the part of women, in many Western English-speaking countries, women became much bitchier to men, much less nice to them, seeing men as oppressors who hold women down and who need to be fought against. This feminist value system penetrated deeply into these cultures, resulting in the day-to-day occurrence of feminazi bitchiness of women towards men. That is, many millions of women, not just a few feminazi extremists who go on slut walks if they can walk at all and not waddle with their 200-pound frames. Now that masculism exists, now that men have their own gender politics, their own gender-based ideology in the form of masculism, men are now able to restore the pendulum so that women lose their gender bias, their anger bias, and learn that women oppress men too, so that women, like men, can learn an anger against female oppression of males. These two gender oppressions, that is, male against females, and that the feminists fight against, and females against males, that the masculists fight against, tend to cancel each other. So one of the major aims of the Masculists is not only teach men of Masculist ideas, but also to teach women of Masculist ideas as well, so that women lose their gender bias, their anger bias, and become nicer to be with as women, the way they were before second and third wave feminism. But we have to reach this point. There needs to be a lot of education of women by Masculists before the two gender biases cancel each other out. This flyer gives suggestions on how Masculists can go on an anti-nagging-pro-nicing campaign against women to stop women nagging and to make them nicer to be with. Up until recently, men had no intellectual tools to counter women's feminist arguments against men. That is no longer the case. For example, read my e-textbook on masculism that is freely downloadable from my website, whose link can be found below. Intellectually armed with masculist ideas, masculist labels, masculist rhetoric, men can now hold their own and even better the arguments of the feminists. This should not be difficult, since men are smarter than women on average and are a hell of a lot more aggressive. Whenever men turn their attention to something, they always dominate it, because men are genetically more capable than women in virtually everything due to men's GMV, greater male variance, outperforming women at the top end of the performance scale across the board. Masculisted men need to teach women to be a lot nicer to men, otherwise women risk being harangued and verbally violenced by angry masculists. This masculist verbal violence could be employed whenever women nag men. Masculists need to so change the zeitgeist that it's taboo for women to nag men. One only has to see how much nicer Asian women are to men to understand why so many Western men prefer the company of Asian women than women of their own culture. When a Western woman nags a man, if that man has had his masculist consciousness raised, he can hit back verbally with a masculist harangue that makes the woman fearful of him, so that she will think twice before nagging a man again. She will also know that thanks to the masculists and the masculist-induced zeitgeist change, that nagging of men by women has become a social taboo. Since women are herd animals, following the crowd of other women in their behaviour, once a substantial proportion of women has learned not to nag, to be nicer to men, then the rest of the sheeple women will feel motivated to do the same. But how to reach that point? To give a taste of how a masculist influenced man could harangue a feminazi nagger, take the following case. F.
Typical male chauvinism. No wonder we women are feminists when you men always think you are so superior to women.
Brackets. If the man this feminazi is talking to, that is nagging, being a feminazi bitch towards, knows nothing about masculism, he would probably just grin and bear it, not having the intellectual masculist tools to not only hit back, but to intellectually crush her, demolish her, make her fearful of ever experiencing another such masculist harangue that so crushes her, thus teaching her a valuable lesson from the masculist perspective. M. Typical feminazi bitchery. You feminazis are so hated by men that we totally ignore you, forcing you to be manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at. We men are male chauvinists because that is the reality of the world. We men are genetically superior to you femalians. You have 10% smaller brains, for Christ's sake. You contribute nothing to world culture. You invent nothing, build nothing, create nothing. We men only tolerate you women because we want to fuck you and we need you to have babies. But now the sex bots are coming out, which can sex men far better than you women. Since 40% of you women are like you, that is, obese, and hence sexually repulsive to men. These bots have luscious curves, film star faces, creamy, grippy vaginas that you fat, unfuckable, ugly, feminazi bitches can't compete with. So we men will leave you rotting on the shelf, you misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi bitch. So literally go fuck yourself, since only the most ugly and desperate of men would fuck you, since they would fuck anything, even women like you. End quote. If millions of men learn masculist ideas, then they would have the above intellectual tools to be able to harangue feminazis the way the above guy did. Women would then learn that men are hitting back, and with a vengeance, with a venom that shocks them. They are not accustomed to being so verbally abused by men and learn to be afraid of it. They learn to shut up and keep their negative feminazi opinions of men to themselves for fear of having a second such very unpleasant female ego-crushing experience. As millions of women go through this experience and millions of men learn masculist ideas, then the zeitgeist will change. Journalists will pick up on the new gender assertiveness of men, influenced by masculist ideas, and advise women to be nicer to men or be blown away with real masculist anger and hatred from men for the way the fluffy feminist hypocrites are financially massacring and destroying the lives of one father in four in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts. Masculists also need to teach society, particularly women, how women oppress men, so that women lose their anger bias, become biconscious, and persuade themselves that they are both feminist and female masculists, seeing both sides of the gender divide, both gender oppressions, so that they can see gender politics the way men do. Losing their gender bias, women will become far less feminazi bitchy towards men and will be much nicer with men. Once this happens, men will have succeeded in their anti-nagging-pro-nicing campaign against women. We men are now ready to launch this campaign because all the necessary weapons are now ready. We have the anger, given the situation in the divorce courts, no paternity rejection right, etc. And we have the ideas, that is masculist ideas, so the fuse is lit. All we men have to do now is go out into the streets and harangue these monoconscious feminazis with masculist wrath and masculist rhetoric, blowing these feminazis away with superior male intellectual and verbal anger. If some feminazis are stupid enough to hit back physically, then the masculists will hit them back with equal force and immediately. because that is what Masculists do to feminazi bitches. Remember, the fluffy feminist hypocrites have taken over the divorce courts and have made them so toxic for males that 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves, thus wiping out whole populations. Thus these fluffy feminist hypocrites who behave as feminists in the parliaments but as fluffies in the divorce courts, not bothering to fip up at high school by bothering to study career competent majors so that they can become fips as adults and not parasite of some man's money. Thus this bitch slapping of monoconscious feminazi bitches is far preferable to shooting them as a means to stop whole populations being wiped out, which is what the feminazis are currently doing and hence must be stopped with bullets if necessary. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In brackets, contains links to 300 YouTube and Minds and BitChute Masculist essays/videos, and to the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 300 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Ciao.